The deputy had the lien notice folded into his coat pocket, but he did not reach for it. He stood in the doorway of the timber shack with the iron latch rimed white beneath his glove, the smell of wet wool and cold ash pressing out from inside, and watched a boy, 5, maybe younger, press both palms flat against the stovepipe, as if testing whether anything alive still lived in the iron. The pipe was cold. The boy's breath clouded between his hands. Behind him, a woman sat perfectly still on the edge of a rope bed, watching the deputy the way a person watches a door that is about to close. The deputy looked down at his pocket. He could not make himself reach for the paper. Ruth Vale Ketchum had not planned to die in the Adirondacks. She had not planned to live there either. But by the second week of October, 1887, the distinction had narrowed to a matter of firewood and arithmetic, and both were working against her. She stood in front of a 16 by 20-foot timber shack 3 miles east of North Creek, Essex County, New York, with a cracked 10-plate stove she could not afford to replace, 2 children she could not afford to feed, and a deed to 40 acres of second-growth spruce that no one in the settlement considered worth the paper the lumber company clerk had signed over. The shack had a flat plank roof patched twice with tar paper. The tar paper had already begun to peel at the northwest corner, where the wind came hardest. Ruth pressed her thumb against the edge and felt it lift like dead skin. Nell stood behind her, holding Asa's hand. Nell was 8 and had stopped asking when they were going home. Asa was 5 and had started coughing 3 days after they arrived. Ruth had $39. She had earned that number the way a quarryman earns a scar, by losing everything around it. Orrin Ketchum, her husband, had died in August beneath a timber sled near Minerva. The sled had shifted on wet ground while the team was unhitched, and Orrin had been underneath checking a runner brace. The doctor had come from North Creek and charged $4 for the pronouncement. The burial cost $11. The lumber company sent a man with a ledger who explained that Orrin's wages through August covered his store account, but not the shack's purchase price, and that Ruth owed the balance of $9 to Judd Croft's general store, where the account had been transferred. $39. A saw that still held its set. A mare leased until April. 2 children, 1 cracked stove, and a roof that let frost form on the inside of its planks before December had even begun. The survival arithmetic was not complicated. It was simply impossible. A cabin this size, this poorly sealed with a cracked stove that bled heat through its fractured side plate, needed 6 cords of seasoned hardwood to survive a moderate Adirondack winter. 8 cords, if March turned vicious. Ruth had 1 3/4 cords stacked against the east wall, most of it soft maple that burned fast and left ash like powder. Soft maple threw heat the way a match throws light, bright and brief, and then gone. 6 cords minimum, 1 3/4 on hand. The gap was 4 1/4 cords, and each cord cost between $3 and $4 delivered, if a man with a team would even haul to her road, which was not a road but a logging track already softening into mud. $17 for wood alone. That left $22 for everything else. Food, lamp oil, medicine for Asa's cough, stove repair if the crack widened, and the $9 she owed Croft. $22 minus 9 was $13. $13 to feed 3 people from October through April. Ruth could sew. She was good with the needle and had worked alongside her father in his Troy sheet metal shop before she married, which meant her hands were steady and her stitches tight. But sewing paid by the piece, and the nearest woman who could bring her piecework was Cora Penfield, 1.5 miles through timber, and Cora had 4 children of her own and no charity to spare. Ruth could not leave. Her nearest relative was an aunt in Troy who already housed 4 boarders in 3 rooms. The children were coughing. The mare was leased, not owned, and selling her would mean no transport at all. Selling the cabin now would bring perhaps $10. Croft had already offered $11, and he would not go higher because he wanted the timber and the scrap iron near the old works, not the shack itself. There was no door marked exit. Every direction Ruth looked, the arithmetic said the same thing. You cannot do this. She unpacked the stove tools and set the children to sorting kindling by size. Nell understood. Asa tried to help, and knocked over the pile twice. Ruth did not raise her voice. She rebuilt the pile and showed him again. The frost came that night. Not hard, just enough to silver the grass and make the tar paper crackle when the wind pressed it. Ruth lay awake listening to the roof. Every gust made the planks shift above her, a faint groaning sound, and each groan let in a thread of cold air that found the back of her neck like a finger. She had 3 weeks before the first real cold, maybe 4. The old men in North Creek said winter came early that year. They said it the way old men say everything, as fact wrapped in warning, delivered to no one in particular and everyone at once. Deacon Truman Vale arrived on the 4th day. He was 61, built like a fence post, and held the unofficial position of settlement conscience. He had been a sawmill foreman for 2 decades before his back gave out, and he still walked like a man measuring board feet. Deliberate, eyes always calculating dimensions. The shared surname was Coincidence. Truman's family had come from Vermont. Ruth's maiden name, Vale, traced to a different line entirely, though the settlement treated the overlap as mildly suspicious, as if God were making a point no one could quite interpret. Truman did not knock. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground and called out, the way men did when approaching a cabin where a woman lived alone. Ruth came to the door with Asa on her hip. Truman studied the roofline first. He always looked at rooflines first. Then he looked at the woodpile, then at the stovepipe, then at Ruth. "I walked your ridge beam from outside," he said. "Your tar paper is lifting on 2 corners. Your chimney draw is pulling left, which means your stovepipe has a kink or your firebox is cracked. Which is it?" "Cracked," Ruth said, "along the left side plate." Truman closed his eyes briefly, the way a doctor does when a patient describes the symptom that confirms the worst diagnosis. "May I look at the roof from inside?" he said. Ruth stepped aside. Truman entered, ducking under the low header, and stood in the center of the single room. He looked up. Ruth watched his jaw tighten. "How many layers of plank?" he asked. "1, with tar paper on top." "Gaps?" "I can see light through 2 seams near the north wall." Truman pulled a folding rule from his coat and extended it upward, pressing it against the underside of the roof planks. He measured in silence for a full minute, moving the rule from spot to spot, pressing, listening. "Your roof is a shelf," he said finally. "Snow will sit on it flat because there is no pitch. 3 feet of wet snow on a 16 by 20 flat roof is—" He paused. "More weight than those wall plates were framed to carry, and every minute that snow sits, it presses the gaps wider, and the cold air drops straight through onto your heads." Ruth said nothing. Truman turned to the woodpile visible through the open door. "How much?" 1 3/4, mostly soft maple. You need 6 cords minimum for a cabin this poor, 8 if March turns. Soft maple burns 1/3 faster than beech or sugar maple, so your 1 3/4 is worth about 1 1/4 in real heat. You're 5 cords short, possibly 7. Ruth had already done this arithmetic. Hearing it from Truman did not make it worse. It made it official. Truman folded his rule and tucked it away. He looked at Asa, who was pressing both hands against the stovepipe, trying to feel warmth that was not there because Ruth had let the fire die to save wood. "A flat roof in this country is a shelf for death," Truman said. His voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a man who had measured enough failures to know what one looked like before it finished failing. "You need pitch. You need shingles. You need 6 cords stacked and a man to swing the axe." "I have none of those," Ruth said. "Then you have arithmetic, not shelter." He offered what he considered mercy. He said he could arrange for the children to board with the Penfield family through winter. Cora had room, barely, and the church fund could cover food for 2 small children if Ruth signed a note against the cabin. Ruth could move to the mill boarding house in North Creek and work until spring. It was reasonable. It was generous even by settlement standards. It would also mean giving up the cabin, the land, and any chance of keeping her family together. Ruth said, "No." Truman looked at her the way he looked at a beam that was about to take more weight than it could hold. Not angry, not dismissive, just already calculating the sound it would make when it broke. He left without arguing. Men like Truman did not argue. They measured, they warned, and they waited to be proven right. Ruth spent the next 9 days trying to survive by conventional methods. Each one failed. She hired a boy from North Creek to help cut wood. He lasted 2 days, took his dollar, and did not return. They had cut a quarter cord of green birch that would not season in time to burn clean. She inquired about coal at the freight office. Coal from the rail line cost $4 a ton delivered, but delivery meant to the North Creek depot, not to her road. Hauling from the depot cost nearly as much as the coal, $8 a ton at her door. She needed at least 2 tons, $16 she did not have. She asked about renting a room in town. The cheapest was $2 a week, $8 a month. Her sewing brought in perhaps $6 a month if she worked every day. The gap was unbridgeable. She could cut wood herself. She had the saw, and she was not weak. But cutting a cord of hardwood alone took a strong man 3 to 4 days. Ruth could manage perhaps half that pace, which meant 8 days per cord. 5 cords meant 40 days of dawn-to-dark labor in worsening cold, with 2 children who could not be left alone and whose coughing grew worse each night. 40 days. She did not have 40 days. She might not have 20. On the 10th day, Asa woke before dawn, shaking. His cough had deepened into something that sounded like cloth tearing. Ruth held him against her chest and felt his ribs through his shirt. He had lost weight. They all had, but Asa had started with less to lose. She fed the stove 2 splits of soft maple and watched the thermometer she had hung inside the doorframe. The cabin climbed from 29 degrees to 41 in 20 minutes, then began to fall the moment the wood burned down to coals. 41 degrees. That was the best her stove could manage in a cabin that gave its heat away through every crack, every seam, every square foot of uninsulated flat roof. 41 degrees with the stove lit. 29 without it. Outside, the air read 19. The cabin was barely better than a windbreak. That afternoon, while Nell watched Asa by the stove, Ruth walked the old ore road toward the abandoned ironworks to gather scrap hinge iron she could sell or trade. The road was 2 miles of frozen ruts through second-growth spruce, climbing gently toward the remains of what had once been the Adirondack Ironworks, a venture that had collapsed decades earlier under the combined weight of ore impurities, impossible remoteness, flood damage, and financial ruin. What remained was a field of rust, broken rail, collapsed shed frames, boiler shells split along their riveted seams, ore carts with their axles seized solid. Ruth had been here twice before, pulling hinge pins and small iron fittings she could carry, but today the wind was different. It came from the northwest in steady pulses, hard enough to make her eyes water, and as she picked her way through the wreckage, she noticed something she had not noticed before. The flat surfaces, the collapsed shed roofs, the iron plates lying level on the ground, the ore cart beds, were scoured clean. The wind had stripped them bare, polishing them to a dull shine. Snow that had fallen 2 days earlier was gone from every flat surface, blown somewhere else entirely. But the curved surfaces told a different story. A half section of a riveted corrugated iron cistern lay on its side like a broken tunnel, its open end facing roughly southeast. The curve rose perhaps 6 feet at its highest point and stretched maybe 20 feet along the ground. It was too large and too heavy to scavenge. Ruth had walked past it every visit without a second thought. Today she stopped. Snow had drifted against the outside of the curve in a smooth bank, packed by the wind into a solid ramp. But inside the curve, the ground was dry. Dry leaves from autumn still lay where they had fallen. The wind came over the top of the arch and continued past without dropping into the sheltered space below. Ruth knelt at the edge of the curve and held out her hand. She could feel the wind above her, the air moving fast over the crown of the arch. But where she crouched, the air was still. Not warm, still. The difference between moving air and standing air was the difference between a draft that stripped heat from everything it touched and a pocket of quiet where heat, if it existed, could linger. She placed her palm flat on an exposed iron plate lying on the ground beside the cistern. Cold. The wind had been working it all day, pulling whatever faint warmth the weak sun had given it. Then she placed her palm on the inside surface of the curve, down near the base where the arch met the ground. Also cold, but the cold felt different. It was the cold of iron that had been sitting still, not iron that had been scoured. The temperature might have been the same. The feeling was not. Ruth sat back on her heels. The wind pressed against the outside of the cistern and made a low sound, almost a hum, as it passed over the crown. Inside the curve, her coat stopped flapping for the first time since she had left the cabin. She thought about her roof, her flat, single-layer, tar paper-patched roof that caught every gust like a sail and let cold air pour through its seams like water through a sieve. She thought about what Truman had said. A flat roof is a shelf for death. But what if the roof was not the problem? What if the problem was that the roof was the outside surface of her cabin, the first thing the wind touched, the thing that took every blow, every degree of cold, every hour of exposure, and passed it straight through to the air inside? What if she could put something between the wind and the roof? Not insulation. She had no sawdust, no straw, no money for batting. Something simpler, something that changed the shape the wind encountered. Something that made the wind climb over instead of striking flat. And between that outer shape and the wooden roof, an air gap, a space where the air did not move. A pocket of stillness that slowed the transfer of cold from outside to inside the way a second shirt slowed the transfer of cold from winter air to skin. The memory arrived without invitation. Her father, Ambrose Vale, in his Troy sheet metal shop. Ruth was 10 or 11. He had taken her hand and held it above a flat iron plate set near the open shop door. She could feel the draft pulling across the plate's surface, carrying warmth away. Then he placed a bent piece of tin between the plate and the door, a curved shield like half a pipe propped on 2 blocks so the air beneath it went still. "Feel," he said. The plate behind the shield was warmer, not hot, warmer. The draft was still there, but it was climbing over the curve instead of raking across the flat surface. "What did you do?" Ruth had asked. Her father said, "I made the air stand still." He never called it science. He never wrote it down. He made stoves for a living, and he understood that wind was the enemy of every stove he built. A stove in a draft worked twice as hard and heated half as well. Block the draft, and the stove could do its job. Ruth stood up in the wreckage of the abandoned ironworks, the wind pressing against her back, and looked at the corrugated iron cistern. It was roughly 22 feet long and 17 feet across at its widest chord. Its crown rose about 6 feet above the ground line. The riveted seams were stained with rust but mostly intact. One seam at the crown showed a hairline split where stress had worked the iron apart over decades of frost. She paced the dimensions against her cabin, 16 by 20. The cistern was wider and longer than the cabin's footprint by several feet. If she could move it, somehow, impossibly, move this enormous curved shell of industrial iron and set it over the flat cabin roof with a gap between, the wind would meet the curve first. It would climb. It would pass over. And beneath the arch, the wooden roof would sit in still air. The stove's heat would not be ripped away through the planks. The roof would stop being the outside surface of the cabin and become an inside surface, protected by iron and stillness. The idea was clear. The idea was also insane. To move the cistern shell, Ruth would need oxen, men, chain, and a gin pole. She estimated the cost at $21. She had 39. If she spent 21 on moving iron, she would have $18 left for everything else: food, wood, medicine, debt. If the shell cracked during the move, she would have spent $21 on scrap. If the arch failed, if it tore loose in a gale or collapsed under snow, she would have no money, no backup plan, and children who were already coughing. The risk was not a gamble. A gamble implied a reasonable chance of winning. This was closer to a desperate calculation, the kind made by people who had already exhausted every reasonable option and found that reason had nothing left to offer. Ruth marked the cistern shell with a piece of chalk she carried for measuring fabric. She scratched a line at each end and a circle around the crown seam where the split showed. Then she walked home through the last light, the wind at her back, her mind running numbers she had not asked it to run. She told no one for 3 days. She spent those days measuring. She paced the cabin roof. She drove sticks into the ground at the 4 corners and sighted across them for level. She measured the height from the ground to the roof peak, barely 7 feet, and calculated how much clearance a 6-foot arch would need above the existing roof if it sat on posts set outside the cabin walls, 2 feet at the crown, narrowing toward the sides, enough for a man or a woman to crawl into the gap between the wooden roof and the iron shell to inspect, patch, or clear debris. She drew the framing in charcoal on the cabin's plank floor while the children slept. 4 posts sunk 3 feet into the ground outside the walls, 2 side beams, each 24 feet long, running the length of the cabin on either side, resting on the posts. The iron arch would sit on the side beams, its weight carried down through the posts to the earth. Not 1 ounce of the iron's weight would rest on the cabin roof. The roof Truman had rightly called too weak to carry snow would carry nothing but the air above it. She calculated the wood she would need for posts and beams, tamarack for the posts, rot-resistant and strong, rough spruce for the beams, scarfed together from shorter lengths because she could not afford milled lumber. She calculated bracing. The arch would catch wind like a sail if it could rack sideways. She needed cross-wire bracing, diagonal wires running from the top of each post to the base of the opposite post, pulled tight with turnbuckles or fence strainers to keep the whole frame rigid. She calculated the stovepipe. The pipe currently rose straight through the flat roof. If an iron arch covered the roof, the pipe would need to pass through the arch as well. That meant cutting an oval collar through the iron shell and adding a raised flashing cone to keep sparks from finding the tar paper below. If she got this wrong, the cabin would burn instead of freeze. She calculated the bottom edge. The arch would not reach the ground. Its sides would end at the side beams, roughly at the level of the cabin's wall plates. Below the arch's edge, wind could still enter the gap. She would need skirt boards, staggered planks hung from the side beams, overlapping like clapboards, blocking direct wind, but leaving narrow drainage gaps so rain and snowmelt could escape instead of pooling. Every calculation led to another calculation. Every answer revealed a new question. But the central logic held. The wind would meet the curve. The curve would send it over. The air between the iron and the wood would stand still. And still air was slow air, and slow air held heat instead of stealing it. She told Cora first. Cora Penfield came on the 4th morning after Ruth's walk to the ironworks. She brought a basket of eggs and a dress that needed hemming, which was Cora's way of visiting without calling it charity. She was 35, thick-armed, plain-spoken, and had buried her second youngest child, a boy named Harlan, during the winter of '85. That burial had made Cora an authority on winter death in a way no man's warning could match. She did not fear the cold. She feared what the cold did to children when their mothers made mistakes. Ruth told her the plan while hemming the dress. She kept her voice flat, as if describing a recipe, because she had learned that men and women both dismissed excitement as evidence of irrationality. Cora listened. She looked at the charcoal drawings on the floor. She looked at Ruth's list of materials and costs. Then she looked at Nell, who was teaching Asa to stack kindling in a pattern, and at the thermometer on the door frame, which read 34 degrees inside at mid-morning. "Iron in March is colder than stone," Cora said. "Only if I ask it to warm us," Ruth said. "Then what are you asking it to do?" "Take the wind's teeth out before it reaches the roof." Cora did not laugh. Women who had buried children did not laugh at survival plans, but she did not nod either. "You are betting $21 on the idea that air can stand still," Cora said. "I am betting $21 on the idea that wind is what makes this cabin cold, not the temperature, the wind." "Those are the same thing." "They are not. Temperature is what the air is. Wind is what the air does. My father taught me the difference." Cora picked up the hemmed dress and folded it over her arm. She stood at the door and looked at the flat roof, where a light dusting of frost still sat because the sun had not yet climbed high enough to reach it. "Your father was a stoveman in Troy," Cora said. "This is not Troy." The heir does not know that, Ruth said. Cora left without promising anything. She also left without telling anyone. That restraint, Ruth later understood, was the first gift Cora gave her. Judd Croft found out on his own. Croft was 46, square-faced, and ran the general store in the settlement the way a spider runs a web, by sitting at the center and letting the threads bring him information. He sold dry goods, hardware, flour, lamp oil, and tobacco. He extended credit at terms he set himself. He held Ruth's note for $9, stove repair parts, and burial goods. And he held similar notes for a third of the families within 10 miles. Croft was not evil. He was efficient. He understood that debt was inventory, and that a debtor's desperation was a form of currency that appreciated over time. Ruth's shack, her timber, and the scrap iron near the abandoned works were worth more to him than the $9 she owed. He could wait. He learned about the cistern because he paid a boy named Tolly to watch the ore road and report who went where. When Ruth made her third trip to the abandoned works with a measuring cord and chalk, Tolly told Croft, and Croft understood immediately what she was measuring. He came to her cabin the next morning, riding a gray mare that was better fed than any animal Ruth owned. "I hear you are measuring iron at the old works," he said from the saddle, not dismounting, which meant he considered this a transaction, not a visit. Ruth was splitting kindling by the door. She did not stop. "Scrap iron is not yours to measure," Croft said. "That land belongs to the timber company, and the salvage rights are unregistered," Ruth said, still splitting. "I asked at the land office. The timber company holds surface rights. The ironworks equipment was abandoned with no salvage claim filed. Anything I can move is mine." Croft's expression did not change, but his posture shifted. Ruth had checked. He had not expected her to check. "A woman alone cannot move a cistern shell," he said. "Then I will hire men." "With what money?" "My money." Croft dismounted then. He tied the mare and walked to where Ruth was working, standing close enough that she had to stop swinging the hatchet or risk hitting him. This was deliberate. Men like Croft used space the way other men used words. "I will forgive $6 of your debt," he said, "if you sign over salvage rights to the iron at the works, all of it. I can sell it downriver for more than $6, and you can stop gambling with your children's lives." Ruth set down the hatchet. "A woman alone can mistake stubbornness for invention," Croft said. "And a man with a ledger can mistake hunger for consent," Ruth said. Croft smiled. The room There was no room. They were standing outside, but the air between them held the same weight as a room full of witnesses. His smile said, "I heard defiance, and defiance from a woman with $39 and a cracked stove is a symptom, not a strategy." He remounted. "The offer stands through November," he said. "After that, the full $9 is due, and I will collect it however the law permits." He rode back toward the settlement, and before he reached the tree line, Ruth could see him calculating. Croft was always calculating. He was calculating right now whether it was cheaper to wait for Ruth to fail or to make her fail faster. The word spread the way words spread in small settlements, not through announcement, but through accumulation. Tolly told his mother. His mother told the woman who sold butter at the crossroad. The butter woman told her husband. By the end of the week, every family within 5 miles knew that the Ketchum widow was planning to drag an iron cistern out of the abandoned works and put it on top of her cabin. At Croft's store, men gathered around the cracker barrel and practiced their disbelief. A teamster named Durfee tapped a spoon against a tin cracker box and said that was the sound Ruth's cabin would make in a storm. Another man said the cabin would ring like Judgment Day. Croft, standing behind his counter, said nothing for a while, letting the laughter build, and then said quietly, "The widow's tin coffin." The phrase caught. By the following Sunday, children were repeating it outside the schoolhouse. Nell came home and asked Ruth what a tin coffin was. Ruth said, "It is what people call something they do not understand." "Do you understand it?" Nell asked. Ruth paused. She looked at the charcoal drawings on the floor, the material list pinned to the wall, The measurements she had checked and rechecked and checked again. "I understand what I measured," she said. "I do not understand what will happen. Those are different." That night, by lamplight, she ran the arithmetic one more time. Even if the arch saved only a third of her wood consumption, even if it performed half as well as she hoped, the children would survive longer. If it saved nothing, they would freeze politely in a cabin that looked exactly like every other cabin that had failed before it. The difference between her plan and no plan was not certainty. It was time. Time measured in cords not burned, in degrees not lost, in nights where Asa's coughing did not turn into silence. She decided she would spend the $21. The next morning, Ruth walked to the ore road before dawn and began marking the path the cistern shell would have to travel. 2 miles of frozen ruts, one creek crossing where the ice might or might not hold under the weight of iron and oxen, 3 turns where the road narrowed between standing spruce. She tied red rags to branches at every point where the shell might catch or the sled might tip. She measured the width of the narrowest gap, 11 feet long, against the 17-foot cord of the cistern. The shell would not fit through lying flat. It would have to be turned on edge, curved side up, balanced on a sled like a boat's hull inverted, and eased through the narrows by hand. The creek crossing was worse. The ice was 6 inches thick by her measurement, which she checked by chopping a test hole with the back of her hatchet. 6 inches could hold oxen. It could not hold oxen, a sled, and 2 tons of riveted iron. She would need to bridge it. Logs laid crosswise, frozen into the ice with water poured over them at night. That alone was a day's work. She returned to the cabin to find Nell feeding Asa broth made from a marrow bone Cora had sent. Asa's fever had broken, but his cough remained, a dry scraping sound that came in fits like a saw binding in wet wood. Ruth held him until the fit passed, then set him near the stove and began writing a list of every man within 5 miles who owned oxen, chain, or a block and tackle. The list had 4 names. One was Croft. She crossed him off. 3 names remained. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Ruth had no answer for Croft that day. She only counted the rivet holes and kept measuring. The following afternoon, she walked to the farm of a man named Prentice Galusha, who owned a pair of oxen and a logging chain. Galusha was 50, quiet, and owed Croft $11 for seed and flour. Ruth offered him $3 cash and 3 days of sewing for his wife in exchange for the oxen, the chain, and 1 day of his labor. Galusha studied her face for a long time. "Croft will not like it," he said. "Croft is not paying you $3, Ruth said. Galusha took the money. She hired 2 more men, a French-Canadian named Pascal Rondeau, who had a gin pole and block and tackle from his work-clearing timber, and a younger man named Edwin Sugat, who had nothing to offer but his back and his willingness to work for $1 and a meal. Total cost for the move, $3 to Galusha, $2 for the gin pole and tackle rental from Rondeau, $1 to Sugat, and the balance for rope, hardware, and the chain fee. $21, exactly as she had calculated. She had $18 left. 9 of those belonged to Croft. 9 were hers. $9 to survive until April. Ruth did not tell the men what the iron was for. She told them only where it needed to go. Rondeau shrugged. Sugat asked no questions. Galusha looked at the cistern shell, looked at Ruth's cabin in the distance, and looked back at the shell. "You are putting this on the roof," he said. It was not a question. "Above the roof," Ruth said. "Not on it." Galusha studied the split at the crown seam. He pressed his thumb against it the way Ruth had pressed her thumb against the peeling tar paper. The iron did not move, but the split was there, a line of light visible when the sun hit the right angle. "If that opens under load," he said, "the whole arch folds." "I know," Ruth said. "Your children are in that cabin." "I know that too." Galusha said nothing more. He hitched the oxen. The iron groaned when the chain tightened around it. The sound traveled through the frozen ground and into Ruth's boots, and she felt it in her teeth. The shell shifted. scraped against the frozen earth, and began to move. Snow crust shattered beneath it. Old leaves and dead grass compressed into dark ribbons. The oxen leaned into the yoke, and the cistern slid forward on runners that Rondo had fashioned from 2 spruce poles, rough, uneven, but enough to keep the iron from digging into the ruts. They made it 400 yards before the first runner split at a knot. Rondo swore in French. Galusha stopped the oxen. Ruth stood in the middle of the ore road with 2 miles still ahead and a cracked runner bleeding sap into the snow. That was Monday. They lost the rest of the day replacing the runner. Winter did not wait. Winter was already here, walking up the valley at its own pace, indifferent to schedules, indifferent to runners and knots, and a widow's arithmetic. The first hard frost came that night, not the silver dusting Ruth had seen before, but a genuine freeze that turned the water in the cabins pale to a disk of cloudy ice by morning. Ruth broke the ice with the back of a spoon and gave Asa the first cup. Then she pulled on her coat, wrapped her hands in the rag strips that served as gloves, and walked back to where the cistern sat abandoned on the ore road, 1/2 mile from the works and 1.5 miles from her cabin. The iron was waiting. The split at the crown seam had not widened, but it had not closed either. Ruth ran her finger along it, the way she would run a finger along a fabric seam to test its hold. The iron was cold enough to sting. She pulled her hand back and looked at the sky. Clouds were building from the northwest, the kind that did not bring snow but brought wind, steady, penetrating wind that would find every crack in her cabin and spend all night pulling heat through them. She had the iron. She had the men. She had the plan. She did not yet have the person who would teach her how to make the plan survive its own construction. That person was coming. He was already watching, but Ruth did not know that yet, and the not knowing was the distance between a drawing on a cabin floor and a roof that could save 3 lives. The temperature dropped 4 degrees by noon. Ruth had 16 days until December. Bramwell Pike did not introduce himself. He appeared the way weather appears, already present by the time you noticed. Ruth found him at the abandoned ironworks on her 5th visit, sitting on an overturned ore cart with his coat buttoned to the throat, and his left leg extended at an angle that suggested the knee no longer bent when he asked it to. He was 67 years old. His hands were scarred across the knuckles in a pattern Ruth recognized from her father's shop. Rivet burns, the kind that came from holding a bucking bar against hot iron while someone else swung the hammer on the other side. He was watching the cistern shell. Or rather, he was watching the place where the cistern shell had been, because the shell was now 1.5 miles down the ore road, sitting on its broken runner where Ruth's crew had left it. "You moved the half cistern," he said. Ruth had come back for the hinge iron she had originally planned to collect before the cistern had changed everything. She had not expected anyone at the works. No one came here. The place was rusted memory. "Part of the way," she said. "I saw the drag marks. You used spruce runners." "They broke." "They would." He shifted his weight on the ore cart. His left knee did not move. Spruce is straight-grained, which is why it splits clean and why it cracks at knots under lateral load. You want tamarack runners, or elm if you can find it. Elm is ugly wood, but it bends without snapping. Ruth looked at him. He had not asked her name. He had not asked what the cistern was for. He had identified the runner wood and diagnosed the failure in 3 sentences. "Who are you?" she said. "Bramwell Pike. I was a rigger on the Erie Canal and a riveter in a boiler yard in Albany for 19 years. My knee went in 62 and my left eye clouded in 79. And now I live in a shack near the Boreas Road because my pension from the yard was $16 a year and Albany costs more than $16 a month." He said all of this without self-pity, the way a man reads an invoice. "You are building something with the cistern," he said. "Yes." "What?" Ruth told him. She described the plan the way she had described it to Cora. Flat, precise, without excitement, posts outside the walls, side beams on the posts, iron arch on the beams, air gap between the wooden roof and the iron shell. Wind meets the curve, climbs over, passes on. Still air below. Heat stays. Bramwell listened. When she finished, he was quiet for nearly a minute. Then he asked the question that told Ruth he was not like Truman, or Cora, or Croft. Why not nail it to the roof and be done? It was a test. Ruth heard the test inside the question, the way she heard the crack inside a split seam, not by the sound it made, but by the sound it should have made and did not. Because the roof is what I am trying to save, she said. If the iron sits on the roof carries the iron's weight, the snow's weight, and the wind's force. The roof is not strong enough. The iron has to carry itself on its own posts, and the roof has to carry nothing but the air above it. Bramwell grunted. It was a sound that contained, compressed into a single syllable, something Ruth would not recognize until later as respect. Then you are not foolish, he said, just undermanned. He came to the cabin the next day without being invited. He brought a rivet hammer with a hickory handle worn smooth by decades of grip, and a sounding rod, a 3-foot length of iron with a flattened tip used to test riveted seams by striking them and listening. Bramwell did not explain. He demonstrated. He walked to the cistern shell on the ore road, knelt beside it with his bad knee grinding audibly against the frozen ground, and struck the first rivet seam with the sounding rod. The ring was high, clean, sustaining. He struck the next seam. Same ring. He moved along the curve, striking every 18 inches, and Ruth heard the pattern change before he told her what it meant. At the crown, where the split showed, the ring went dull. Not dead, dull. A sound with a flat bottom where the vibration should have climbed. Hear that, Bramwell said. The split. More than the split. That seam has lost its clamp. The rivets are holding position but not pulling the plates together. Under load, the kind of load you will put on this when you lift it, that seam will open another 1/4 inch. Maybe more. Will it hold? Bramwell struck the seam again. He pressed his ear close to the iron, which meant pressing his good eye against the rust-roughened surface, and listened. It will hold the lift, he said. It will hold dead weight on the beams. But if a hard gust catches the arch broadside, not over the curve, broadside, and if the bracing is not tight, that seam will work. Every gust will open it a little more. And one night you will hear a sound like a gunshot, and that will be the seam letting go, and the arch will fold, and everything underneath it will be under 2 tons of iron instead of above it. Ruth felt the cold then, not the air cold. The cold of understanding precisely how close her plan stood to killing her children instead of saving them. Can it be reinforced? She asked. The seam? No, not without a forge, and a day I do not have in my knee. But the arch does not need to be perfect. It needs to be braced so that the wind never catches it broadside. Crosswires, turnbuckles, fence strainers. You pull the diagonals tight enough that the arch cannot rack sideways even a 1/4 inch, and the crown seam never takes the load that would open it. He stood up slowly, using the sounding rod as a cane. Your design is correct, he said. Your materials are adequate. Your problem is not the idea. Your problem is that you are building a boiler yard structure with no boiler yard crew and no boiler yard tools, and every joint you cannot make tight is a joint that will try to kill you in February. Ruth said, Will you help me? Bramwell looked at the cabin in the distance. Smoke crawled from the crooked stovepipe. The flat roof was visible as a dark line against the spruce. 1 meal a day, he said, and I keep my own hours. Done. And you listen when I tell you something is wrong, even when you do not want to hear it. I always listen, Ruth said. Listening and hearing are different animals, Mrs. Ketchum. Your father would have told you that. Ruth startled. She had not mentioned her father. Bramwell held up his scarred hands. Ambrose Vale's shop in Troy made the best box stoves north of the Tappan Zee. I bought a stove from him in '68. Your hands hold tools the way his did, from the inside out, not the outside in. He picked up the rivet hammer and offered it to her. Ruth took it. The handle fit her grip as though it had been waiting. They worked together for 5 weeks. The labor was brutal, specific, and unforgiving. Week 1. Posts. 4 tamarack posts, each 10 inches thick, sunk 3 feet into frozen ground. Ruth and Bramwell dug the post holes with a mattock and an iron bar, taking turns swinging while the other cleared loose earth. The ground was frozen 8 inches down. Below that, it was clay and stone. Each hole took a full day. By the 4th hole, Ruth's palms had split along the callus lines and bled through the rag wraps she used as gloves. Bramwell showed her how to wrap them tighter, a spiral starting at the wrist, looped through each finger, secured with a knot she could pull free with her teeth. Nell brought water. Asa sat bundled near the work and watched. His cough came and went in waves. On the good days, he stacked pebbles. On the bad days, he leaned against the cabin wall and breathed with his mouth open, each exhale a thin fog. Week 2. Side beams. 2 beams, each 24 feet long, had to run the length of the cabin on either side, sitting on top of the posts. Ruth could not afford milled lumber. Bramwell taught her to scarf shorter lengths of rough spruce, a diagonal cut through each end, the 2 pieces overlapping like clasped hands, drilled and bolted through with iron rod stock. The first beam split at the scarf during testing. The sound was sharp, a crack that echoed off the cabin wall and made Nell flinch. Bramwell examined the break without expression. "Green wood," he said. "The grain was not straight here. Feel." He put Ruth's hand on the broken face. She could feel the grain curving, a subtle sweep where the tree had grown around something, a buried branch or a rock, and the fibers had bent to accommodate it. The bend was invisible on the outside. It was fatal on the inside. "How do I tell before I cut?" Ruth asked. "You sight along the log. If the bark lines run true, the grain runs true. If the bark twists, the grain twists. Your eye is your best tool, Mrs. Ketchum. Better than any measure." They cut a new scarf. Ruth sighted the grain first this time. The second beam held. Week 3. The cistern shell moved again. Rondo returned with his oxen and the repaired gin pole. They replaced the spruce runners with tamarack, as Bramwell had specified. The new runners did not crack. The shell slid down the ore road at the pace of a man walking slowly, lurching over ruts, the iron groaning at every jolt. The creek crossing held. Ruth's log bridge, frozen into the ice with 5 nights of poured water, supported the weight. The ice cracked at the downstream edge, a sound like a door slamming, but the bridge logs did not shift. By late afternoon, the cistern sat in the cleared ground beside the cabin. It looked enormous. Against the 16 by 20 shack, the iron curve loomed like the ribcage of an animal Ruth could not name. Nell stood in the doorway and stared at it. Asa asked if it was a boat. "It is a roof," Ruth said. "It does not look like a roof." "No," she said, "it does not." Truman Vale came that evening. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at the cistern shell, then at the posts, then at the side beams, then at Ruth, who was scrubbing rust from the iron's lower edge with a wire brush Bramwell had brought. "You are actually doing this," Truman said. "I am actually doing this." Truman measured the air gap with his eye. He walked the perimeter. He touched the crown seam and found the split. "This seam is not sound," he said. "I know," Ruth said. "The bracing will keep it from opening." "What bracing?" "Cross wires, turnbuckles, diagonal tension from post top to opposite post base on all 4 faces." Truman looked at Bramwell, who was sitting on an upturned bucket, eating the cornbread Ruth had made that morning. Bramwell looked back at Truman and said nothing. "Who designed the bracing?" Truman asked. "I did," Ruth said. "Bramwell taught me the principle. The sizing is mine." Truman processed this. A woman who had never built anything larger than a stove fire had designed a structural bracing system for a 2-ton iron arch. He did not say this was impossible. He said something worse. "If you are wrong about the wire gauge, the first hard wind will pull those posts out of the ground and drop the iron on your children while they sleep." Ruth stopped scrubbing. She looked at Truman, and for the first time since his first visit, she let him see something other than flat calm. She let him see the fear. just for a moment, just enough for him to know she had already thought about the iron falling on her children, had already lain awake calculating the angle of collapse and the position of the beds and the seconds it would take to pull Nell and Asa clear. "I know," she said. Truman left. He did not offer to check the wire gauge. Week 4. The lift. This was the day that would determine whether Ruth's $21 had purchased salvation or catastrophe. The cistern shell had to be raised from the ground, tipped upright, walked on edge to the cabin, and lowered onto the side beams. If the shell cracked, the project was over. If the side beams failed under the weight, the project was over. If the gin pole snapped or the block and tackle let slip, someone could die. Rondo set the gin pole 12 feet from the cabin's east wall. A single tamarack trunk, 20 feet tall, guyed with 4 ropes staked to the frozen ground. The block and tackle hung from the pole's crown, the rope threading through 3 pulleys that multiplied force but divided speed. Every foot of lift took 3 feet of rope hauled. Galusha's oxen stood hitched to the hauling end. Shugat, Rondo, and Bramwell positioned themselves along the shell's edge. Ruth stood at the base of the gin pole with a mallet, ready to drive wedges under the shell as it rose. Croft arrived at the worst possible moment. He rode his gray mare to the edge of the clearing and sat watching, his hands folded on the saddle horn, his expression the careful blank of a man who wanted witnesses to his restraint. "You will freeze under a kettle," he said, loud enough for every man present to hear. No one answered. Rondo spat. Shugat looked at his boots. Galusha checked his oxen and did not turn. "Haul," Bramwell said. The oxen leaned. The rope stretched, creaked, hummed. The shell tilted upward from the ground, its lower edge biting into the frozen earth. Rust flaked from the rivet seams in thin orange sheets. The iron groaned, a deep, resonant sound that Ruth felt in her chest, the way she had felt the drag marks vibrate through her boots weeks earlier. The shell rose, 2 feet, 4 feet. The gin pole flexed but held. Rondo guided the upper edge with a rope loop, keeping the curve from spinning. Shugat pushed a timber cradle under the rising edge. 6 feet up. The shell was nearly vertical now, balanced on its lower rim, the curve facing the sky. It looked like the hull of a ship that had never been finished. Then the wind hit. A gust, not a storm gust, just an ordinary November gust that no one would have noticed on any other day, caught the flat inner surface of the shell and pushed. The shell swung on its rim. Rondo's guide rope snapped taut and yanked him off his feet. The gin pole shuddered. Galusha shouted at the oxen, who lurched sideways. The shell swung toward the cabin's northwest corner. If it struck, it would shear the corner post clean and collapse the side beam before the beam had ever taken weight. Bramwell moved faster than a man with a ruined knee should have been able to move. He threw his body against the shell's lower edge, bracing it with his shoulder, and shouted a word Ruth did not hear because the blood was already roaring in her ears. She drove 2 wedges under the rim in rapid succession, striking each one with 3 blows that sent splinters into the air. The shell stopped swinging. It settled onto the wedges with a sound like a bell struck underwater, deep, muffled, final. Bramwell staggered back. His face was gray. His left leg was shaking. "Brace it," he said. "Now, before the next gust." They braced it with ropes and timber while it stood on edge. Then, over the next 4 hours, they tilted it slowly toward the side beams, feeding rope through the block and tackle inch by inch until the arch settled onto the beams with a weight that made the tamarack posts groan and the frozen earth compress under the footings. The iron did not crack. The crown seam did not open. The side beams held. Croft had watched the entire lift. When the arch was seated, he turned his mare and rode back toward the settlement without speaking. He did not need to speak. The story would travel on its own, shaped by his silence into whatever form suited him best. Week 5, bracing and finishing. Bramwell taught Ruth to rig the cross wires, 4 diagonal wires, each running from the top of one post to the base of the post diagonally opposite, creating an X pattern on each face of the structure. Each wire terminated in a turnbuckle. a threaded sleeve that could be tightened with a wrench, pulling the wire taut. Tight is not enough, Bramwell said. The wire must sing. Hit it with the sounding rod. If it rings, it is carrying tension. If it thuds, it is slack, and slack wire is the same as no wire. Ruth tightened the first turnbuckle. Bramwell struck the wire. Thud. More. She tightened again. He struck. A faint hum. More. She tightened until her wrist ached. He struck. The wire rang, a high, clear note that hung in the cold air like a tuning fork. Now the next one. Cora's oldest son, Eli Penfield, appeared on the third day of bracing week. He was 14, silent, and carried a coil of old telegraph wire he had found in his uncle's barn. He dropped it at Ruth's feet and left without explaining. The wire was copper-coated iron, strong and flexible. Ruth used it for the secondary bracing, shorter diagonal runs between the side beams and the cabin's wall plates, tying the arch structure to the building below so that lateral forces transferred down through the cabin's frame into the ground. Cora came the next day. She came angry because Eli had gone without permission, and she came to take him home. But when she saw the arch from below, the curve of iron against the gray November sky, the wire bracing, humming faintly in the steady wind, the air gap visible as a dark space between the iron shell and the wooden roof. She stood still for a long time. "You built this," she said, not a question. "Bramwell and I, and Rondo, Galusha, and your son." Cora looked at the air gap. She looked at the wooden roof, dry and sheltered beneath the iron. She looked at Ruth's hands, wrapped in rags stained brown with dried blood and rust. "I will hold the next brace," she said. She did not say she believed. She said she would hold a brace. For Cora, that was further than belief. It was labor. Bramwell's final teaching that week was the most critical: the stove pipe. The pipe rose through the wooden roof and now had to pass through the iron arch as well. Bramwell insisted on 3 things: clearance, the pipe must not touch the iron at any point; a raised collar, a cone of sheet iron flashed around the pipe opening, rising 6 inches above the arch surface to keep rain and snow from entering; an ash distance. The nearest tar paper on the wooden roof must be at least 18 inches from the pipe, because sparks caught in the air gap between the 2 roofs would find fuel if tar paper was close. Ruth measured. She cut. Bramwell checked every measurement with his sounding rod, not because the rod was the right tool, but because tapping iron near a joint told him whether the pieces were seated tight or floating loose. The skirt boards went on last. Staggered planks hung from the side beams along both long walls, overlapping like clapboards. Each plank angled slightly outward at the bottom so that rain and snowmelt would drip away from the cabin wall instead of running down it. Between the planks, Ruth left gaps, not open holes, but staggered slots where air could seep out slowly. Bramwell had warned her about sealing the gap completely. "Warm air from your stove will rise through the roof boards into the gap," he said. "If the gap is sealed like a bottle, that warm air will hit the cold iron above and condense. You will get frost on the underside of the iron, and that frost will melt during the day and drip onto your wooden roof, and your wooden roof will rot from above. The gap must breathe, but it must not blow." Small, hidden weep gaps. Air could seep. Wind could not drive. Ruth understood. She thought of her father again. How he would adjust a stove damper, opening it just enough to let the draft draw, but not enough to let the heat fly up the chimney. Control? Not blockage, not freedom, control. The arch was finished in the last week of February, 1888. 5 weeks of labor, $21. Every muscle in Ruth's body ached in a way she had not known was possible. Not the sharp ache of a single injury, but the deep, distributed ache of a body that had been used as a tool beyond its design limits, the way a handsaw feels when you use it to pry. Snow tested the arch first. A moderate fall in the final days of February dropped 6 inches of wet snow on the settlement. The flat roofs collected it. The peaked roofs shed most of it. Ruth's arch shed all of it. The curve was steep enough at the shoulders that wet snow could not grip. It slid off in sheets, accumulating in banks at the base of the skirt boards where Ruth shoveled it clear. Bramwell hung a second thermometer in the air gap, a cheap tin-backed instrument he had traded for at the crossroad. Ruth already had one inside the cabin and one outside on the north wall. Now she could read 3 temperatures: outside air, air gap, and cabin interior. On a calm, cold night in late February, with the stove banked low, the readings told a small story. Outside, 9 degrees. Air gap, 18 degrees. Cabin interior before dawn, 38 degrees. 9 degrees warmer in the gap than outside. 20 degrees warmer inside the cabin than in the gap. The still air was holding, not dramatically, not miraculously, but measurably. Ruth walked to Cora's cabin that morning and asked to read her kitchen thermometer. Cora's cabin had a peaked roof, better sealed than Ruth's, with a proper stove that did not crack. Cora's kitchen before rekindling read 29 degrees. Ruth's cabin was 9 degrees warmer than Cora's, with a worse stove, with a cracked side plate. Cora looked at the numbers. She did not say Ruth was right. She said, "March has not spoken." Truman came. He read the thermometers himself, squinting at the mercury lines, and shook his head. "Calm weather proves nothing," he said. "Any shelter holds heat in calm air. Your test is wind, hard wind, the kind that comes in March." Croft said nothing publicly. Privately, through the gossip chain that ran on the same threads as his debt network, he said the iron would sweat and rain frost on the children, that the condensation would turn Ruth's cabin into an ice cave. He said it with the confidence of a man who had never measured a temperature in his life, but understood that confidence itself was a form of currency. Ruth checked the weep gaps. No frost on the underside of the iron. The gaps were working. The air breathed without blowing. She was burning wood at roughly 2/3 her previous rate. Her remaining cord and a half was lasting. If the rate held, she had enough to reach mid-April. If the rate improved as she learned to manage the stove more carefully, she might have wood to spare. But Truman was right. Calm weather proved nothing. The arch had been built to fight wind, and the wind had not yet arrived to fight. On March 11th, the rain came. It was wrong rain, warm and heavy, falling from a sky that had no business being warm in the Adirondacks in March. Snow softened, roofs dripped, ice in the creek loosened and shifted. Men in the settlement relaxed, because warm rain in March felt like deliverance, like winter's grip finally breaking. Bramwell did not relax. He came to the cabin that afternoon and stood looking at the falling barometer Ruth had hung near the door, a glass tube in a wooden frame, the mercury dropping steadily since morning. "This is bad weather changing clothes," he said. Ruth looked at him. "Warm air from the south hitting cold air that has not left," Bramwell said. "When the cold pushes back, the warm has nowhere to go but up, and everything that was rain becomes something worse." He made Ruth retighten every turnbuckle on the windward bracing. Her hands shook from cold and fatigue. The turnbuckles resisted. She wrapped the wrench handle with a rag strip for grip and forced each one another half turn until Bramwell struck the wires and heard the ring he demanded. "If I am wrong," Bramwell said, "you have lost an hour of sleep. And if you are right, then you will be glad your wires are singing." That night the rain turned to hard pellets. They struck the iron arch with a sound like gravel thrown against a drum. Ruth lay in bed with Asa curled against her chest and Nell pressed against her back and listened to the iron ring. The wind shifted northeast. The sound changed. The pellets became snow. The snow became thick, horizontal, wind-driven. By midnight, the cabin was shaking. March 12th, 1888. The Great Blizzard. Ruth woke to a sound she had never heard before. The iron arch was singing. Not the clean ring of a tested brace wire, but a deep sustained hum, the voice of an enormous curved surface being played by a wind that had no intention of stopping. The hum rose and fell with the gusts, and between the gusts, when the wind drew breath, there was a silence that was worse than the noise because it meant the next gust was gathering. She lit the lamp. The cabin thermometer read 36 degrees. The stove was down to coals. She fed it 2 splits of hard maple. She had been saving the hard maple, rationing it the way a soldier rations ammunition, and now was the time to spend it. The firebox caught and the iron ticked as it heated. Asa coughed in his sleep but did not wake. Ruth pulled on her coat and opened the door. She could not open the door. Snow had drifted against it during the night, packing the frame tight. She put her shoulder against the planks and pushed. The door moved 2 inches. Cold air screamed through the gap. Not flowed, screamed, carrying snow crystals that stung her face like thrown sand. She pushed harder. The door opened enough for her to see outside, and what she saw stopped her breath. The world was gone. Not hidden. Gone. The spruce trees that marked the edge of the clearing were invisible. The sky and the ground were the same color, the same texture, the same howling white nothing. The wind was not blowing from a direction. The wind was the direction. Everything moved. Ruth closed the door. She wedged it with a stick of firewood and stood with her back against it, breathing hard. "Mama?" Nell was sitting up in bed, holding the blanket to her chin. "Stay in bed," Ruth said. "Both of you, stay in bed and stay warm." She read the thermometers. Inside, 36, climbing slowly as the stove caught. Outside, she could not reach the outside thermometer, but she pressed her hand against the cabin's north wall and felt the cold radiating through the logs like heat radiates from a stove, only reversed. The logs were conducting the outside air's temperature into the room, but the ceiling was different. Ruth pressed her hand against the underside of the roof planks, the planks that Truman had called a shelf for death. They were cold, but they were not the killing cold she had felt before the arch. They were the cold of wood that was sheltered, still losing heat, still imperfect, but not exposed to the full violence of the wind that was tearing across the settlement at that moment. The arch was between the roof and the storm. The wind hit the curve, climbed, passed over. Ruth could hear it, the hum of the iron above, the different quality of the air inside the gap, a layered sound that told her the still air was holding even now, even in this. Then Asa woke coughing. Not the dry scrape she had heard for weeks, a wet rattling cough that came from deeper than his throat, from somewhere in his chest where the cold had been sitting for months, waiting. He coughed until his face went red and his eyes streamed and he could not draw breath between the spasms. Ruth held him upright, one hand on his back, the other pressing a damp cloth against his forehead, and counted the seconds between coughs the way Bramwell counted the rings of tested iron. He needed warmth. Not 36 degrees, not the 41 her stove could manage on a normal cold night. He needed the room above 40 and held there steadily for hours, while his chest loosened and his breathing found its rhythm. Ruth fed the stove. 3 splits. 4. She was burning through her rationed hard maple at a rate that would exhaust it in 2 days instead of the week she had planned. But Asa was coughing, and the storm was screaming, and the arithmetic that had governed every decision since October was now the arithmetic of hours, not weeks. The cabin climbed. 38, 40, 42, and held. 42 degrees in a cabin with a cracked stove and a single plank roof, while a storm that would later be called the Great White Hurricane buried the Northeast under drifts 50 feet deep and killed over 400 people from Chesapeake Bay to Maine. 42 degrees because the wind could not find the roof, because the iron arch sent it climbing, because 2 feet of still air stood between the storm's teeth and Ruth's children. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because Ruth's roof had passed the easy part. The sound from above had changed. The hum was climbing in pitch, and one of the brace wires on the windward side had begun to sing a different note. Ruth heard it at the same moment Bramwell did. He had come to the cabin the previous evening, before the storm's full arrival, to check the bracing one final time. Now he sat in the corner nearest the north wall, wrapped in a blanket, his bad knee propped on a rolled coat, and his head was tilted to one side the way a man tilts his head when he hears something no one else has noticed. "The northwest lower brace," he said. Ruth listened. She could hear it now, a tone slightly flat against the others, like a single string on a fiddle slipping out of tune. "It is losing tension," Bramwell said. "The turnbuckle is backing off, or the post is shifting in the frost." "What happens if it fails?" "That corner of the arch becomes free to rack. The wind catches the broadside edge and pushes. The crown seam takes the lateral force it was never meant to carry. The seam opens." He paused. "How fast depends on the wind." Ruth looked at the door, wedged shut against the snow. She looked at her children. Asa had stopped coughing and was breathing shallowly against Nell's shoulder. Nell's eyes were open. She was listening to the adults the way children listen when they are too young to help and old enough to understand. "We have to go into the gap," Ruth said. "In this wind?" "The gap is sheltered. That is the point." Bramwell looked at her, and what passed between them was not disagreement. It was the shared recognition that the plan Ruth had built, the arch, the bracing, the still air, was now going to require her to trust it with her body, not just her arithmetic. They crawled into the gap through the access space at the east end, where the skirt boards were hinged for exactly this purpose. The gap was 2 feet high at the crown and narrower at the sides, enough to lie flat and work, not enough to kneel. The wind outside was a roar. Inside the gap, the air was cold and still and loud with the vibration of the iron above. Snow needles drove through the staggered skirt boards in thin horizontal lines, stinging any exposed skin. Ruth found the northwest lower brace by feel. The turnbuckle had not backed off. The post had shifted. Frost heave, the slow, invisible expansion of frozen ground pushing the post's base outward by fractions of an inch. Enough to slacken the wire, enough to change its note. Bramwell said, "Do not grab the wire. If it is under partial tension and you add your weight, it will either snap or pull your hand into the turnbuckle. Take strain off first." Ruth remembered. He had taught her this during bracing week, the principle of never adding force to a system under unknown tension. Loosen before you tighten, relieve before you repair. She loosened the turnbuckle 3 turns. The wire went slack. Then she drove a wedge under the post base, pushing it back toward plumb, and retightened the turnbuckle until the wire sang again. She struck it with her knuckle because the sounding rod was inside the cabin. The ring was clean. Bramwell checked the other 3 braces from where he lay. They were holding. As they turned to crawl back toward the access hatch, a gust hit the arch from directly north, and the entire iron surface flexed. Ruth felt it through her elbows and her ribs. A pulse of movement, the arch breathing under load. The sound it made was not the sustained hum she had heard from inside the cabin. It was a single deep boom, like a drum the size of a room struck once by a fist the size of a house. The arch settled. The wires held. The boom did not repeat. They crawled back inside. Bramwell's right sleeve was dark with blood. A loose strip of flashing at the edge of the access hatch had caught his forearm and opened a cut 4 inches long. He pressed his left hand over it and said nothing. Ruth saw the blood. She sat him down, cut a strip from the hem of her own shirt, and wrapped the wound with the same spiral technique he had taught her for her blistered palms. The symmetry was not lost on either of them, but neither of them mentioned it. "You should not have gone out there," he said. "You should not have come with me. Someone had to watch you do it right." "I did it right." Bramwell almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile Ruth had seen from him in 5 weeks of working together. The storm raged for 36 hours. During those hours, Ruth fed the stove in measured intervals, 2 splits every 90 minutes, never more, never less, and watched the thermometer as if it were a pulse she could not afford to lose. The cabin held between 44 and 47 degrees. Outside, the temperature dropped to 2 degrees by dawn on the 13th and stayed there, locked, as if the air itself had frozen solid. 47 degrees inside, 2 degrees outside. A difference of 45 degrees, held steady by a cracked stove, a single plank roof, and 2 feet of air that the wind could not reach. At some point during the second night, someone pounded on the cabin door. Ruth wedged the firewood free and pulled. Cora Penfield stood in the gap with all four of her children, the youngest wrapped inside her coat, the oldest, Eli, carrying a sack of flour and a face so red with cold that the skin looked burned. Cora's cabin had failed. Wind had driven snow under a roof seam and into the bedroom. The temperature inside had dropped to near freezing. The children were shaking. Ruth opened the door. 7 people in a 16 by 20 cabin with one cracked stove. She fed the fire 3 more splits. The room climbed to 51 degrees and held. 51 degrees. 9 people. 1 stove. A storm that was killing people on the roads, that was collapsing roofs and burying livestock, and turning the northeastern United States into a landscape of ice and silence. Bramwell sat in his corner with his bandaged arm and his bad knee and watched Ruth move between the stove and the children. He watched her measure the wood she had left, a quarter cord, maybe less, and calculate how many hours it had to last. He watched her hands, still wrapped in the stained rags, still steady, still moving with the precision of a woman who had learned to work iron in her father's shop and had never forgotten how to make the air stand still. He said quietly, so that only Ruth could hear, "Your father would have understood this, Ruth." Ruth did not look up from the stove. "He would have argued with me first," she said. Across the settlement, the storm did what storms do to structures built without understanding. Truman Vale's woodshed lost its door to a gust that wrenched the hinges from the frame. The firewood inside was buried under drifting snow within an hour. Croft's store lost part of its rear lean-to, the section he had added cheaply, with flat roofing and inadequate bracing. Flour, salt, and seed got wet. Pascal Rondeau, the French-Canadian who had helped move the cistern, was found after the blow beside the remains of his collapsed shanty, alive but with frostbitten hands that would never close fully again. No one in the settlement died. Others in the region were not as fortunate. Reports would come later of travelers frozen on roads, of boats destroyed, of entire towns cut off for days. At dawn on March 14th, the wind finally dropped. Not gradually, suddenly, as if someone had closed a door in the sky. The silence was shocking. Ruth opened the cabin door and looked at a world remade in white. The drifts reached the eaves on the north side. The iron arch rose above the snow like the spine of something enormous and patient, glazed with ice, steaming faintly where the warmth from the air gap met the frozen air. Ruth stood in the doorway with Cora's youngest child asleep on her shoulder and looked at the thermometer on the north wall. It read 4 degrees. Inside, the cabin held at 44. 40 degrees of difference still, even as the storm withdrew. Asa was breathing evenly. His cough had quieted during the night, loosened by the steady warmth that had held while everything outside was trying to break in. Ruth did not cry. She had not cried since Orrin's death, and she was not going to start now. But she stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the arch, listening to the silence, and feeling something she had not felt since the day she had pressed her palm against the inside of the cistern at the abandoned works. Still air, standing still, holding its ground. The roads opened 3 days after the storm. Men with oxen and shovels cut trenches through the drifts that had buried the ore road and the main track into North Creek. The trenches were narrow, barely wide enough for a single wagon, and their walls rose above a man's head, packed snow glazed hard as plaster. Walking between them felt like walking through a canyon carved from winter itself. The first person to reach Ruth's cabin after the roads opened was not Truman or Cora or Croft. It was the deputy, Asa Prine, who had come in October with the lien notice and had hesitated at the door when he saw Ruth's boy pressing his hands against the cold stovepipe. Prine came now on foot, carrying a county ledger and a list of damaged properties he was required to inventory for the assessor's office. He stood in the cleared ground and looked at the arch. Ice still coated the iron in a thin glaze that caught the morning sun and turned the curve into a band of pale fire. Snow had drifted against the skirt boards, but the boards had done their work. The drifts banked against the outside while the air gap remained clear. The stovepipe rose through its collar, dry and intact, a thread of smoke climbing straight in the still morning air. Prine wrote something in his ledger. He did not share it with Ruth, but he stood there for a long time, and when he left, he walked slowly, looking back twice. Truman Vale came on the fourth day. He did not announce himself. He walked into the clearing, stood beneath the arch, and looked up. Ruth was inside sewing a shirt for Galusha's wife, payment still owed from the oxen hire. She heard his boots on the packed snow and came to the door. Truman's beard had frozen during the storm, and he had cut most of it off, leaving his jaw exposed and gaunt. He looked 10 years older than he had in October. His woodshed had lost its door, and half his seasoned firewood had been buried under snow that had melted and refrozen into a block he was still chipping free. He stood under the iron curve and placed his hand against the underside of the arch, the way a man places his hand against a horse's flank to feel whether it is calm or trembling. "The iron is dry," he said. "The weep gaps kept it clear," Ruth said. "Bramwell warned me about sealing it tight." "Bramwell Pike." "Yes." Truman lowered his hand. He walked to the nearest skirt board and examined the staggered overlap. He looked at the gap between the skirt board's lower edges, the drainage slots Ruth had left for snowmelt. He looked at the brace wires, still taut, still singing faintly in the light breeze that came and went, like breathing. "I judged the iron as roof," Truman said. His voice was careful, not humble. Truman did not do humble, but careful, the way a carpenter speaks when he has misread a grain and the board has split where he did not expect it. "You used it as weather." Ruth could have accepted the admission and let it stand. Instead, she corrected him, because correction was more honest than grace, and Truman was a man who valued honesty over comfort. "I used it as distance," she said. Truman looked at her. "The iron is not keeping us warm," Ruth said. "The air between the iron and the roof is keeping us warm. The iron is just the thing that makes the air stand still. If the iron were flat, the wind would find the gap and fill it with motion, and the whole system would fail. The curve sends the wind over. The air stays. Distance is what matters. 2 feet of still air." Truman pulled out his folding rule. He extended it and held it vertical between the underside of the iron arch and the top of the wooden roof. 2 feet at the crown. He read the measurement twice, as if confirming something he already knew. 2 feet, he said. 2 feet. Truman folded the rule and put it away. He did not apologize. He did not say Ruth had been right and he had been wrong. He said something better. "Show me the bracing." Ruth showed him. She walked him through the system the way Bramwell had walked her through it. Posts first, then side beams, then cross wires, then turnbuckles, then skirt boards, then flashing. She struck each brace wire with her knuckle and let him hear the ring. She pointed out the crown seam, still split, still holding, because the bracing kept the lateral forces from reaching it. Truman listened with his whole body, the way he listened to structures. When she finished, he nodded once. "I will use this on my woodshed," he said. It was not an apology. It was adoption. An adoption from Truman was worth more than any apology could carry. The neighbors came in ones and twos over the following week, the way water finds cracks. Slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. They came because roads were open, and because gossip had traveled faster than shovels. The Ketchum widow's cabin had held at nearly 50 degrees during the worst storm in living memory. The Ketchum widow's children were alive and warm, and her wood supply was holding. The Ketchum widow's iron arch had not torn loose, had not collapsed, had not rained frost onto the children below. They wanted to see, and then they wanted to understand. Ruth showed them. She stood in the cleared ground beside the cabin and explained the system the way she explained sewing, by pointing at each piece and naming its job. She pointed at the posts. "These carry the weight. The cabin roof carries nothing." She pointed at the side beams. "These connect the posts and hold the iron." She pointed at the brace wires. "These keep the arch from rocking sideways. Hit one. Listen." A man named Osgood hit the wire with his knuckle. The ring was clear. He hit it again, harder. The ring sustained. He looked at Ruth with an expression she had seen once before. On Bramwell's face, the first day he had grunted after hearing her explain why the iron could not touch the roof. She pointed at the air gap. This is what saves us. 2 feet of air that does not move. The iron takes the wind. The air takes the cold. The roof stays sheltered. She held up a 2-foot lath she had cut for the purpose. Measure this against the gap anywhere along the arch. It should read the same. If it reads less, something is settled and you need to check your posts. An older woman named Patience Sugat, Edwin Sugat's mother, asked the question everyone was thinking. How much wood did you burn? Ruth had kept count. During the 3-day blow and its aftermath, she had burned less than 1 cord. In the same period, by her neighbor's own reporting, Cora had burned nearly 2 cords before her cabin failed. Truman had burned 1.5 cords and lost more to the buried woodshed. The settlement average, for cabins of similar size, was roughly 1.75 cords for the storm period alone, less than 1 cord against 1.75 cords. Ruth had enough wood left to reach spring. Most of her neighbors did not. The numbers moved through the settlement the way Croft's insult had moved, by accumulation, by repetition, by the slow weight of fact pressing against the lighter weight of scorn. Cora came last. She came on the 8th day after the storm, after her own roof had been patched and her children had returned home from Ruth's cabin. She came alone. She stood under the arch and looked up at the iron, and then at Ruth. I told you iron in March was colder than stone, Cora said. You did. The iron is still cold. It is. Cora put her hand against the wooden roof, reaching up into the gap. She held it there for a long time. But the roof is not, she said. No. Cora dropped her hand. Show me the rivets, she said. Ruth showed her. She gave Cora the sounding rod Bramwell had left and taught her to tap each rivet and listen for the ring. Tight rivets rang clean. Loose rivets thudded. Cora tapped her way along the lower seam with the focus of a woman who had buried a child and did not intend to trust anything she could not verify with her own hands. I want to learn this, Cora said. Not because I was wrong, because my children were cold. It was the most honest thing anyone in the settlement had said to Ruth since October. Judd Croft did not come. He did not visit the arch. He did not read the thermometers. He did not ask about wood consumption or bracing or the 2-foot gap. He stood behind his counter and sold nails and flour and lamp oil at the same prices as before, and when customers mentioned the Ketchum roof, he said what he had prepared himself to say. The cabin sits in a hollow, he said. The wind passes over it regardless. The iron is decoration. This was not true. Ruth's cabin sat on level ground with no hollow, no ridge, no windbreak of any kind between it and the northwest. The iron was the windbreak. But Croft said it with the quiet certainty of a man who understood that a lie repeated calmly sounds more reasonable than a truth delivered with excitement, and he had decades of practice at calm repetition. He did something worse. He raised the price of nails by a penny each and hinge straps by 3 cents. The increase was small enough to seem like ordinary market adjustment. But Ruth needed nails and hinge straps to build the smaller windshields she was already planning, and the increase meant her supplies cost 10 to 15% more than they had before the storm. Croft was not punishing Ruth. He was taxing her success. If her method spread, he wanted to profit from every copy. Ruth said nothing about the price increase. She bought what she needed, paid in coin, and left the store without meeting Croft's eyes. Croft watched her go and entered the sale in his ledger with the same handwriting he used for everything Sal, neat, precise, and as empty of feeling as a column of numbers could be. Bramwell Pike moved into a pattern with Ruth that was neither employment nor friendship, but something closer to what her father might have called apprenticeship in reverse. A master teaching not a student, but an equal who had arrived at the same conclusions through different paths. They began building smaller arched shields for sheds and woodpiles in the weeks following the storm, using salvaged corrugated iron and split-barrel hoops bent to shape. The smaller shields were simpler than the cabin arch but carried the same principle. A curve over a flat surface, an air gap, still air. The wind climbed over. The protected space beneath stayed calmer, drier, and marginally warmer than the exposed space beside it. Bramwell taught Ruth a neater lap seam, a way of overlapping corrugated iron sheets so that the ridges nested and the joint lay flat without requiring rivets at every corrugation. A seam that lies flat sheds water like a duck's back, he said. A seam that stands up catches wind and lifts. Ruth taught Bramwell to mark measurements in chalk, large enough for his clouded eye to read. His left eye had worsened through the winter, the film that covered it thickening until he could distinguish light from dark on that side, but nothing more. He compensated by turning his head, bringing his good eye to bear on everything, but the constant turning gave him headaches that he did not mention, and Ruth did not ask about. They argued. Not once, but frequently, the way two people argue who share a goal but disagree on the route. Bramwell wanted to make the shields heavy, thicker iron, tighter seams, more bracing, because his instinct, formed in the boiler yard, was to overbuild. Ruth wanted to make them lighter, thinner iron, wider seams, less bracing, because her instinct, formed by poverty, was to build what people could afford. A shield that tears loose in the first gale is worse than no shield, Bramwell said. A shield that costs more than the shed it covers is a thing no one will build, Ruth said. Then they will not build it. Then their children will be cold. Bramwell looked at her. The argument was familiar to him. He had heard it in the boiler yard between the engineers who wanted perfection and the foremen who wanted production. He had stood on both sides at different times in his life. Now, sitting on Ruth's porch with his bad knee propped and his clouded eye turned away from the sun, he found himself on both sides at once. Lighter, he said finally, but not thinner wire. The wire is the skeleton. Everything else is skin. They compromised. Lighter iron, fewer seams, same gauge wire. The compromise held. Bramwell's wound from the storm, the 4-inch cut from the loose flashing, had closed but not healed. By May, the skin around it was pink and tight and hot to the touch. Ruth cleaned it with boiled water and wrapped it with fresh cloth, but the infection had settled into the tissue in a way that cleaning could not reach. He did not complain. He continued working through the summer, building shields with Ruth, teaching her to read iron by sound, showing her how to judge the temper of a rivet by the color of the heat mark around its head. But his movement slowed. The arm he had cut was his right arm, his hammer arm, and by July he was swinging the rivet hammer with his left hand, which lacked the precision his right hand had spent 40 years building. Ruth watched him deteriorate the way she watched a slow crack in iron, not with alarm because alarm was useless, but with measurement. Each week she noted what he could do and what he could not. She did not mention the notes. Bramwell did not ask about them. In August, a letter came from Albany. Bramwell's niece had a room. She had written 3 times before, but Bramwell had not answered because answering meant admitting he could not stay. Now his hands shook when he gripped cold iron, and the shaking was not from age alone. It was from the infection that had never left, the wound the storm had given him as payment for helping Ruth build the thing that saved her children. He told Ruth on a Tuesday evening, sitting at her table, eating the cornbread and salt pork that had become their shared meal. Asa was drawing on a slate. Nell was reading by the lamp. "My hands cannot close around cold tools," Bramwell said. "If I stay through another winter, I will not be teaching you. I will be warming myself by your stove while you do the work." Ruth said nothing for a long time. "You are not a burden," she said. "I am not yet. I will be. And I would rather leave while you remember the man who taught you to sound iron than stay until you remember the man who sat in the corner and shook." He left in September 1889. He took nothing from the cabin except his coat, his sounding rod, and the folding razor he sharpened each morning with a discipline that had outlasted every other habit. The rivet hammer he left on the shelf beside Ruth's stove. "Never let them call guessing what you measured," he said. Ruth held the hammer after he climbed onto the Albany-bound wagon. It was heavier than she remembered, or her hands were more tired than she knew. The handle was smooth from decades of grip. His grip, and before that, some other riveter's grip, and before that, the hands of whoever had turned the hickory on a lathe in a shop that no longer existed. She hung it on a nail above the stove, where the warmth would keep the hickory from drying and cracking. Then she went outside and struck the nearest brace wire with her knuckle, listening for the ring he had taught her to hear, confirming that the wire was taut, that the tension held, that the system was intact. The ring was clean. Bramwell was gone. The two things existed in the same moment, and neither one changed the other. The widow from Johnsburg arrived in October 1889. Her name was Lotta Brink, and she carried a sick infant wrapped in a shawl that had been patched so many times the original fabric was no longer visible. She had walked 9 miles from Johnsburg after hearing from a peddler that a woman near North Creek had built a roof that kept heat in during the blizzard. Lotta did not ask for charity. She asked for instruction. She had a cabin similar to Ruth's, flat-roofed, poorly sealed, single plank, and she had survived the blizzard of '88 by burning every piece of furniture she owned except the bed. She had no furniture left to burn. Ruth looked at Lotta's hands. They were cracked and rough, the hands of a woman who had been working alone for longer than Ruth had. The infant coughed, a thin, reedy sound that Ruth recognized because she had heard it from Asa a year earlier. "I will teach you," Ruth said, "but I cannot build it for you. You have to understand why each piece is where it is, or you will not know what to fix when something fails." "Things fail?" "Everything fails. The question is whether you know what to do when it does." This became the model. Ruth did not build roofs for people. She taught people to build roofs. The difference mattered, because a roof built by someone else was a mystery that stopped working the moment something broke, while a roof built by the owner was a system that could be repaired by the person who understood it. Ruth held a demonstration beside Croft's store the following week. She did not ask Croft's permission. She sat up in the road in full view of the store's front porch and placed 2 tin cups of water on a board. One cup sat exposed to the steady autumn wind. The other sat behind a curved scrap of corrugated iron, propped on 2 blocks, with a 2-inch gap between the iron and the board. She left them for an hour. When she returned, the exposed cup had a skim of ice. The sheltered cup was still liquid. She did not lecture. She let the crowd touch the cups. She let them feel the difference between the iron that had been in the wind and the board that had been behind it. She let them measure the gap with their fingers. 2 inches here, she said. 2 feet on my cabin. The principle does not change with the size. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather turns. Ruth's neighbors had laughed once. Now they were holding the cups and measuring the gap with their own hands. Winter came again. 1889 into 1890. Not a blizzard winter this time, an ice storm winter. The threat arrived differently, not as horizontal wind and driving snow, but as freezing rain that coated everything in glass. Trees split under the weight, fences collapsed. The world turned into a surface that could not be walked on, worked on, or trusted. The ice found Ruth's arch and tested it in a way the blizzard had not. Freezing rain coated the lower skirt boards and sealed the drainage gaps with ice. The weep holes that Bramwell had insisted upon, the gaps that let the air gap breathe without blowing, froze shut. Within 2 days, Ruth noticed condensation forming on the underside of the iron arch. Frost crystals appeared along the rivet seams where the warm air from below met the cold iron above. Bramwell had warned her. Trapped warm breath can frost under iron. The weep gaps were the system's lungs. Without them, the air gap became a sealed cavity, and a sealed cavity with warm air on one side and cold iron on the other became a condensation engine. Ruth did not panic. She did what Bramwell would have done. She went outside with a hatchet and chipped the ice from 3 skirt boards on the leeward side, opening the weep gaps just enough for air to move through. Then she loosened 1 skirt board on the windward side, not removed it, loosened it, so that the incoming air was broken by the board's angle but not blocked. The gap could breathe again. The condensation stopped within a day. The frost crystals on the underside of the iron sublimated, turned from ice to vapor without passing through liquid, and the air gap dried. She had applied Bramwell's lesson alone, not his specific instruction. He had never described an ice storm scenario, but his principle. The gap must breathe. Warm air rises and meets cold iron and makes water. The water rots the roof. Stop the water at the source by letting the air move, slowly, controlled, the way a stove damper lets a draft draw without letting the heat fly away. She wrote to Bramwell that week. She described the ice storm, the sealed weep gaps, the condensation, and the fix. She described it in the same flat, precise language she used for everything. Measurements, actions, results, no feelings, no sentiments. Just the facts of a system that had failed in a new way and been repaired by a woman who understood why it had failed. Bramwell's reply came 3 weeks later in handwriting that shook more than it had the previous autumn. He wrote, "You did not guess. You measured. That is the difference between a builder and a debtor to luck." Ruth pinned the letter above the stove, next to the rivet hammer. Croft made his move that same winter. He had watched Ruth's demonstration outside his store. He had watched the neighbors visit her cabin. He had watched Truman adopt her measurements for his woodshed rebuild. He had listened to Lotta Brink describe the roof she was building in Johnsburg with Ruth's guidance. And he had calculated, because calculating was what Croft did, that the method Ruth had invented was spreading without his involvement, which meant spreading without his profit. Croft bought a load of thin corrugated iron from a salvage dealer in Glens Falls. The iron was cheaper than what Ruth had used, lighter gauge, poorly galvanized, already showing rust at the edges. He hired a man to bend the sheets over a log into rough curves and advertised what he called Ketchum roofs at his store for $3 per set of sheets. He did not include bracing wire. He did not include turnbuckle hardware. He did not include instructions for post setting, air gap measurement, skirt boarding, or flashing discipline. He sold the visible part, the curved iron, without the invisible structure that made it work. The first 3 customers were men from outlying farms who could not afford Ruth's help or would not ask a woman for instruction. They nailed the curved sheets directly to their existing roofs, the thing Bramwell had tested Ruth about on their first meeting, the thing she had known not to do before she had a word for why. 2 of the 3 roofs held through mild weather. The third, a chicken shed belonging to a man named Aldrich, collapsed during a moderate wind in January. The curved sheets, unbacked and unbraced, caught a gust broadside, lifted at the leading edge, and peeled backward like bark from a dead tree. The sheets struck the ground and bounced, and one edge caught Aldrich's 12-year-old son across the shoulder, knocking him to the frozen ground and cutting through his coat to the skin beneath. The boy was not badly hurt, a bruise and a shallow cut, but the collapse was visible from the road, and the boy's cry carried, and by nightfall the story had reached every family in the settlement. Croft blamed Ruth's method. He said it casually behind his counter, with the same calm certainty he had used to deny the arch's effectiveness after the blizzard. "The Ketchum roof," he said. "You see what happens." Ruth heard about the collapse from Cora, who heard it from Eli, who had seen the sheets on the ground. Ruth walked to the Aldrich property the next morning. She examined the fallen sheets. She saw immediately what was wrong. No posts, no side beams, no air gap, no bracing, no skirt boards. The iron had been nailed flat to the shed roof. Wind had found the leading edge and done what wind always does to a flat surface that gives it a grip. She walked to Croft's store. The store was full. Men sat around the stove. Croft stood behind the counter. The room went quiet when Ruth entered, the way rooms go quiet when the subject of recent gossip walks through the door. "Your iron is not a roof," Ruth said. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way she spoke to Cora, to Truman, to Bramwell, flat, measured, precise. A curve without bracing is a sail. A curve nailed to a roof without posts is weight on a structure too weak to carry it. An air gap full of wind is not still air. Croft said, "I sold what people asked for." "You sold the part they could see. You left out the part that holds it up." "I am not a builder, Mrs. Ketchum. I am a storekeeper." Then stop selling buildings. The room was silent. Every man in the store understood both sides of the exchange. Croft had sold a cheaper product, and a boy had been hurt. Ruth had built the original, and the original had held. The question was not who was right. The question was who the room would side with, and in a settlement where Croft held half the debt and Ruth held none of the power, the answer was not obvious. Ruth did not wait for the room to decide. She turned to the men directly. If anyone wants to build a windshield, I will teach you for free. But I will not teach you to build what Mr. Croft is selling, because what he is selling will fail, and when it fails, it will fall on someone who cannot get out of the way. She left. The room stayed quiet for a long time after. Croft did not pull the thin iron from his shelves, but he stopped calling them Ketchum roofs. He called them wind sheets and sold them without Ruth's name attached. The distinction mattered to him. It mattered to no one else. Osam. Elias Ward arrived in the settlement in February of 1890, in the middle of the ice storm winter, driving a wagon loaded with a portable forge and a face that suggested he had seen enough weather in his 38 years to stop being surprised by any of it. He was a blacksmith from Warrensburg, widowed 2 years earlier, traveling a circuit of small settlements doing stove repair, tool sharpening, and hardware fabrication for families too far from a proper smithy to make the trip. He had heard about the collapsing wind sheets and about the woman who had built the original arch, and he had come partly for the work and partly because a blacksmith who repaired stoves understood heat loss the way a doctor understood fever, as a symptom whose cause mattered more than its temperature. Ruth met him because her cracked stove needed attention. The crack along the left side plate had widened during the second winter, and the firebox was losing heat through the fracture in a visible shimmer that made the air above the crack dance. Elias examined the stove without speaking. He ran his finger along the crack, pressed the plate on either side, and tapped the casting with a small hammer, listening to the same kind of ring Bramwell had taught Ruth to hear in riveted seams. "I can plate over this," he said. "A strap bolted across the crack with fire cement in the joint. It will not fix the casting, but it will close the leak." "How much?" Ruth said. $2 for the plate and bolts, $1 for the work." Ruth had the money. She nodded. Elias worked at the stove for an afternoon. Ruth watched. She watched his hands, the way he held the bolts, the way he tapped the plate into position, the way he checked the fit by running his fingertip along the seam. His hands moved the way Bramwell's hands had moved, and the way her father's hands had moved, from inside the knowledge outward, not from outside in. When he finished, Ruth asked to see his brackets. He had a box of iron brackets he had forged for various purposes: shelf supports, hinge plates, corner braces. Ruth picked through them. Most were standard work, competent, but unexceptional. Then she found one that was different, a curved bracket bent to roughly match the profile of a barrel hoop, with small notches filed into its edge at regular intervals. "What are the notches?" she asked. "Measurement marks," Elias said. 2 inches, 6 inches, 12 inches. Saves carrying a separate rule when you're fitting a bracket in a tight space. Ruth looked at him. He had built measurement into the tool itself. Not as an afterthought, as a design principle. The bracket did 2 jobs. It held something, and it measured something, and neither job compromised the other. "I want to show you something," Ruth said. She showed him the arch. She explained the posts, the beams, the air gap, the bracing, the skirt boards, the flashing. She struck a brace wire and let him hear the ring. She held up the 2-foot measuring lath. Elias listened the way Bramwell had listened, with his whole body. When she finished, he did not compliment her. He did not say it was clever or brave or remarkable. He said, "Your brackets are wrong." Ruth blinked. "The angle iron connecting your side beams to the posts," he said.